I asked him, I said, how long do you think we'll survive? Because I figured, he's seen a lot of animals die in traps in the wintertime. We're kind of like an animal
basically
in a
the
trap.
same. Yeah.
So he should have a pretty good idea how long we're going to survive. And he said, we'll make 5 days. So I think we can make 5 days. So I was like, well, guess we're going to live 5 days.
Welcome to the Coffee in a Hangar podcast. My guest today is Art Warbelow. This is part 2 of my conversation with Art. And in this episode, he shares his unique take on off-airport flying and excerpts from his off-airport course, which he taught for the FAA. Enjoy. You taught a class on off-airport flying for the FAA, right?
Right, yeah. I used to
That's an unlikely turn.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was an unlikely turn that they would. I eventually was rehabilitated with the FAA, but it took a lot of years. I finally figured out it was easier to get along, to work with them, than it was to be adversarial. I didn't enjoy the adversarial relationship with them that my dad did, but we had a pretty adversarial relationship for 20 years with them, really until I went out on my own, and then I had a very different relationship with the FAA afterwards. And they at one point approached me to do a talk at some of their seminars on off-airport operations. So I put together a seminar, and I did that for a number of years. I would do those talks.
So can you just sort of give me, let's just kind of set the scenario. I've got a couple hundred hours, and I'm just gung-ho to get out there and do what I see the Ellises do,
Yeah.
right, on the YouTube. What do you teach me to help me?
Yeah, the first slide that I showed in that was Bill Sewell's mall on the end of the Rumble Creek runway. And I would put that slide up, and I would tell people, I said, this is what should be in your mind, what you should be thinking about anytime you're going to land off airport or take off airport. You should be sitting there on the end of the runway with your hand on the throttle or on short final, and what you should be thinking is, I'm going to wreck my airplane in this operation. How is it going to happen? Is it going to be because I got too much weight, I don't get in the air? Is it because the wind's blowing downwind? Because, what is the reason that I'm going to wreck the airplane? And how am I going to explain it to my wife, to my insurance company, to the FAA? What am I going to tell them about why I wrecked my airplane? That's a pretty negative way to look at things, and I think a lot of people saw it that way. But I think the problem is that especially probably a lot of people that will look at this video, they're hunters. They're private pilots with a nice Super Cub, all decked out with all kinds of stuff, and they're going to go out hunting. And once you see a 60-inch moose, a place that's adequate to land your Super Cub will appear within walking range of that moose, regardless of whether it exists or not.
I get that.
And, we talked before, I'm not a hunter. I'm an accidental pilot. I never intended to be a pilot.
Yeah.
I intended to go off to the university and be a civil engineer. And I don't love flying, like a lot of people that probably are going to watch this.
Yeah.
Flying has always been a way to make a living for me. I don't go out and fly around airplanes for fun. When I get in an airplane, I'm like, who's paying me to do this? And so I have had a different perspective on it. And wrecking airplanes, and as we were talking earlier about, you don't want your customers to see you do things that they feel unsafe. I want my customer to wake up when I shut the engine off on the ground. I don't want them to be sitting there tense on the end of their seat. I want them to be comfortable and nothing scary is going on here. So anyway, this concept of thinking about having in your mind, I'm going to wreck the airplane, I think will prevent you sometimes from doing stupid things. If Kenny had thought about when he turned around, if he'd thought, I'm going to wreck the airplane on this camera pass, and I'm going to do this, how would I wreck the airplane if I was going to wreck it here? You might decide, maybe I won't do this. So even though it's a really negative way to look at things, I think it's the way you should look at it. I learned this, oddly enough, my idea about this came from a AOPA Air Safety Foundation flight instructor renewal clinic that I went to. I used to go to those every 2 years because I never did enough instruction to renew without that. So I used to go to those. And one time I went to one, and a guy by the name of Chaz Harrell was speaking there. And he had done some work for the California Highway Patrol. And there was a situation where a trooper had pulled over some guys in a car for some minor traffic violation. And it turned out there were a couple of bad guys with guns, and the guy ended up in a gunfight with them. And at one point, he went up to the back of the car with a 12-gauge shotgun and shot right through the back of the window with the 12-gauge shotgun, and he hit one of the guys with a pellet, and it really aggravated him, and they got in a gunfight. And the trooper was standing behind his car, behind the tire, as they were instructed to do when they're in a gunfight, shooting at they're shooting at each other. And he was using his service revolver at this point. And when they found him, the trooper, dead behind his car, they found the revolver. He was reloading, and they found the 6 empty cartridges, primer side down, lined up on the pavement. And the reason that happened was because that's the way they trained on the range. They reloaded ammo. So you couldn't just, hit the ejector and throw the cartridges on the floor. They trained them when they were training to take the cartridges out and line them up on the railing, primer side down. And that's what he did when he died.
Jeez.
And Chaz's point was that you do what you're trained to do in a stressful situation. So make sure that you are training the way you want people to react.
Oh, man.
And so out of that, he had built what he called a color code model. And what he did was, the color code was white, yellow, orange, or red. And he said, I want to demonstrate, what these color codes are. And so he said, imagine you were, you've had a long day, you come home from work, your girlfriend's coming over, you build a fire in the fireplace, you got the polar bear rug laid out, your girlfriend comes over, you guys are laying on the rug, pop a bottle of wine open, and you're having some wine. And there's like 60 or 80, this is back when everybody went to these things, there's like 60 or 80 guys, mostly old white guys, because that's who did instruction back then, sitting in this room. And you can just see where their mind is. They're laying on that polar bear rug.
Polar bear rug, that's the other funny thing about it.
Yeah, drinking their wine with their girlfriend. And Chaz pulled a starter pistol, .38 starter pistol with a blank in it, out of his pocket and shot it right in the class, live round. And everybody was like, everybody just sat there. And his point was, he said, you are all in condition white. I just pulled a gun out and shot it, and none of you did anything. You didn't react. You just sat there because you're in condition white, because your mind is on a polar bear rug with your girlfriend. And his point was, don't be in condition white when you're doing dangerous things in an airplane. So, condition yellow and condition orange and condition red. I mean, condition red is like you're in a multi-engine airplane on takeoff, 50 feet in the air, and the right engine quits. So he gave us a 3M, those stickies, those dots, an orange one. And he said, put this on the panel in your airplane. And every time you get ready to take off or land, think about, you want to be in condition orange. You want to be thinking, the engine's going to quit on this takeoff when I'm 50 feet in the air past the end of the runway. What am I going to do? And I think that's a really good, flying in general, but certainly in off-airport operations, where you're dealing with one-way landings, takeoffs where at the point where you can rotate, you're committed. You're not stopping. It's the way to go. So that's the first thing. I think you have to be in the right frame of mind, and you shouldn't be thinking about a 60-inch moose and this positive image of, I'm going to get a moose, and I just need to land first. So that's the first thing.
Well,
the second thing is, let's talk about equipment. If you look at those pictures, the airplanes that I started out flying in are just stock Super Cubs. And when I look at people now, people have got all these double slotted flaps on their Cubs and extended wings and big motors and 35, everybody's modifying their airplane so it can fly slower. And I used to always say that to me, I would rather have a stock Super Cub with a decent set of tires, at least 26-inch tires, and a bore prop, and probably at least a 160-horse engine. But beyond that, I would rather just have an airplane that I have flown for a long time, and I know exactly how that airplane reacts, than to crawl into your to get into this airplane. I mean, I'm sure this has got lots of neat stuff on it, but I've never flown this airplane. And I don't know what its strengths are and what its weaknesses are. And I'm sure you've flown different Cubs. Every Cub I've flown is different. And I flew the Cub I learned how to fly in, 4375 Zulu, was a 68 Super Cub that I learned how to fly in, and I flew until 1981 when I wrecked it shooting wolves from the air. So I'd flown that airplane, learned to fly in it, and flew it for 11 years. And I knew that airplane like the back of my hand. And when Charlie and Ron and I were flying, we all had our own Cub. And we would have sooner lent our girlfriend to our brother than let them fly our airplane. We never let one another fly our airplanes.
Crazy.
You didn't do that because you didn't know what the guy might have done to it. And when you're, doing that kind of flying, you want to know exactly what your airplane's going to do. And every time I've only really flown 4 different Cubs in my life, extended periods of time. And every one when I got it, I was like, this just doesn't fly like my other Cub. And then 5 years later, you're like, this is the best Cub I've ever had. Because you learn its strengths and you take advantage of them and you know its weaknesses and you avoid them.
Yeah.
And I think that knowing your airplane is far more important than whether you have double slotted flaps or 35-inch tires. A lot of that stuff is just crutches for lack of knowledge of your airplane.
And so can I kind of repeat back to you what I think you're saying, just for clarification? If you got all those fancy things and you learn to fly that and you learn the strengths and weaknesses of that, that's fine. You're not criticizing those 35 tires necessarily, are you? Or are you, because you can still learn the strengths and weaknesses of that.
Yeah. In some ways, though, I am criticizing some of this stuff, and I'll tell you reasons why. I think we talked before about the big tire situation. When I started out flying, all we had was the 2511 Ford Goodyear tires that were a tube-type tire. And that's what we flew for a while. And then Guy Selman started making these modified tires. And he made a 24-10-6 tire. And 95% of the flying I've ever done off airport has been done on those 24-10-6 tires.
Wow.
Both my brothers, as he made larger tires, the 29s and the 31.5s, they used those big tires. And I flew beside them into the same places for years. And, at this point, I'm jerking their train saying, the reason you guys need those big tires is because you're not as good a pilot as I am. Because I can go exactly the same places you can with this smaller tire that is lighter and has less air resistance. I can fly faster. I can carry more, the same weight, and the airplane's lighter. I can carry more. And, there are places, Charlie especially liked to find places to land that really you could only land with the 31-inch tires, which are usually muskeg bogs.
Yeah.
That were just no reason to be landing there. Water in between stuff, and you're just kind of landing through a whole bunch of trash. To me, it's just there's no skill involved. You just kind of land and hope the tires roll you over all this stuff. So I do think that a lot of this stuff, if you really know your airplane, you don't need it. And some of it can be a downside because all of these things, you look at a Cub with double slotted flaps on, they weigh more than these flaps. So those planes are heavier, as you add all this stuff on. The other thing, and I kind of make this point when I talk about my opinion, how you should take an airplane off. Well, let's just talk about taking an airplane off.
Okay.
To me, there's not a lot of technique. The airplane takes itself off. It's not a highly skilled operation by the pilot. You know, I mean, the airplane either takes off or not.
Yeah.
And to me, the first thing you do on taking off is you get to the end of the runway. And that doesn't mean you taxi to as rough a place as you can, then turn around. You know, I usually push my airplane back and I pick up the tail and roll it back into the rough that you can't take off on. I mean, you know, that's what, 15, 20 feet.
Yeah, right.
And if you're taking off on a place that's 250 feet long, that's like 6, 7, 8% of the runway. And you're only going slow in that part. And when you hit the power, you can immediately get weight off the tail. So getting, you know, you don't never want to leave any runway behind you, including some that you might not call runway, but you can use for takeoff.
Right.
So that's the first thing. The second thing you do is you get the tail up and you roll to the end of the runway. Don't take off before the end of the runway. I mean, if the runway is long enough and eventually the airplane flies off, okay. But otherwise, I'm not rotating until I'm at the end of the runway.
Yeah.
And then I'm pointing at the top of whatever the first obstacle is. I'm never going to climb above that obstacle. I'm going to aim at the top of it. Because I like to think of, you know, when you're taking off, you're buying altitude with power. It's like going to the store and taking out money and buying something. You're taking out power out of your wallet and you're buying altitude with it. Now sometimes, have you ever gone and you buy something, maybe something especially that you don't need. You go to the store and there's something there and you're like, I really want that.
Yeah.
And you buy it. And then you come back a week later and it's on sale. 30% off.
Yeah.
And you're like, damn, I didn't even need that last week. I could have just waited till this week and bought it cheaper.
Yeah.
Well, that's what taking an airplane off is like. So you want to buy altitude. And you can buy that altitude at a slow speed, and you're going to pay a lot of money for it. You're going to pay a lot of horsepower at a slow speed. But if you're in a Cub, the cheapest, the altitude is on sale at 73 miles an hour. That's the airspeed that takes the minimum power to keep the airplane in the air. And that's where I want to buy altitude, where it's the cheapest.
Can you explain what you mean by it's the cheapest?
Well, that's the best rate of climb. It's the best, this is the speed at which it's going to take the least induced drag, combination of induced drag and parasite drag, to keep the airplane in the air, the lowest power. So you've got the most excess power to climb.
Yeah. Are there other costs to it though? Like your story about the check ride in the 185 was kind of, I mean, this is kind of back to that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm buying the altitude at a very high cost. And the problem was I was out of money.
You mean in this scenario where
yeah, when
he
I'm
pulled
taking
the power
off
on
at
you.
the minimum speed and I'm climbing at above power off stall speed. You know, I mean, when you climb you look in the Cub manual, it says the best angle to climb is 45 miles an hour. Stall speed's 43. You know, I mean, you can probably do that, but that's 2 miles an hour. I have a hard time splitting that here.
Yeah,
And you're buying that altitude at a very high cost. Whereas if you just get the nose down and get it to 73 or anything over 45, I mean, whatever you can get it over.
Yeah.
So in other words, stay on the runway until you can get the maximum speed you can up to 73. And that means you go to the end of the runway and then you buy altitude at the lowest cost you can, which is point at the top of the tree. And if you hit that tree because you can't make it, there's nothing else you could have done. If you take off quicker or you climb steeper, neither one of those would have done any good.
Yeah. In other words, you're going to point it at the top of the tree, and if when you get to the tree, if you're going 41 miles an hour,
you're toast.
you couldn't have done any better.
You couldn't have done any better. So that's why I say the takeoff is really a simple thing.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of technique involved here. There is some mental decisions about should I take off uphill, into the wind, or downhill, downwind. There's some calculations on stuff like that, how soft the runway is and so on. But beyond that, it's just a case of do not rotate until you're at the end of the runway. Get the tail up as soon as you can to reduce the drag, and rotate at the end of the runway and point at the top of the obstacle.
Do you have an example of like how you learned this, like a story?
Yeah. Well, I got a picture of how I learned it. Here's a Helio Courier. That's an airplane that we bought new in 1973. That's a 1973 Helio Courier. In that accident, we bought it probably in June, and that's it in August. It
Nice.
lasted 2 months. And my brother Ron was flying that airplane. And, Ron was, like I think I said earlier, Ron's a better pilot than I am. So I'm not really blaming him for what happened here. I would blame Greg McDonald, who's the guy that sold us that airplane. Greg was the Helio dealer in Seattle, and we bought 2 Helios from him that summer. Both of them were wrecked by November. And Greg taught us how to fly the Helio. We'd never we'd never flown one. And he taught us in a way that Ron did this. This was wrecked on our runway that we built at Tanacross. It was about a 2,000-foot runway, which is plenty of room for a Helio. Ron had 4 people in their gear in it. It was probably over gross, but not a lot of gross. I mean, I've flown that Helio Courier with 2,000 pounds of sugar in the cabin on it. A Helio will, if it's flown right, will lift a lot of weight. So he was probably a little over gross, but
This is, when you say it that way, it sounds terrible, by the way.
What
He's probably only a little over gross.
he's probably,
This is something that Alaskans have been doing forever, and I'm not saying it's okay, but just
Yeah.
for audience of people that don't know, that's
Yeah.
not uncommon, unfortunately.
in that era,
Yeah, in that era,
that
that's what I mean.
was not only common, if you pretty much had to do it to compete commercially. If you wouldn't do it, your competitor would do it, and you wouldn't have any customers.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, I just wanted
Yeah.
to put that side note in so people know.
That was part of my conversion later in life. I mean, we never flew over gross. It makes a difference what kind of airplane you're flying too. Later in my commuter operation, we flew mostly Chieftains. Well, a Chieftain at gross weight, on a day above 68 degrees, if you lose an engine, you're coming down. So flying a multi-engine airplane over gross, you eliminate the safety of flying a twin-engine airplane.
Wow.
A Helio in other categories, in non-static standard category, you look at the Super Cub, the A model Super Cub that I did a lot of flying in. It's an agricultural airplane. In another category, you can fly it substantially heavier. So it's not like the wings are going to fall off from it.
Okay, so this was slightly over gross. He's taken off.
Yeah. So the problem was that he flew it like Greg had taught him to fly it, which is get it in the air in an impressive way with the slats out and the flaps down. And then he flew down the runway in ground effect until he flew into the trees. That airplane with that load on a 2,000-foot runway, you could have taken off, probably climbed to 20 feet and landed. But if you buy the altitude at high cost, and a Helio is the most underpowered airplane I've ever flown. I mean, when you look at the wing on it, the Helio Stallions with the PT6 on the front of them had 550 horsepower, and that was probably about the right power to weight ratio for that wing. But that airplane has 295 horsepower. And if you get it on the backside of the power curve, and it has a very large backside of the power curve.
Just because of the slats and the
The
flaps
slats
and
and the
everything.
flaps,
is just,
and yeah.
Wow.
It has huge flaps and slats. And it will never climb out of ground effect. If you're flying slow and you got a load in it, it won't climb out of ground effect.
and so he, instead of getting the speed he needed in the bank, getting his savings up, you know, before he tried to.
He bought what altitude he got at very high cost, and then he didn't have enough money to get over the trees.
That's a very interesting way. The way you explain that's great.
So that, you know, the takeoff to me is like I said, it's technically not that difficult. The airplane does the takeoff. But getting back to your question about all the additional stuff, you know, all these, you put double-slotted flaps on a Cub, it will make the Cub fly slower. You'll have a lower stall speed. If you put slats on a Cub, it will fly slower. But at what cost?
Well, what is the cost?
The cost is drag. And so if you're going to fly a Cub around with double-slotted flaps and slats on it, you're buying your altitude at very high cost. You're probably going to have to bolt on a 180 horse engine, among other things. And you're still, if you're heavy and you try and fly around at 30 miles an hour, it may not stall, but it'll be like a Helio. You know, a Helio won't stall. You can go up, firewall it, pull a stick all the way back, and it will sit there, never brakes, but it's descending. It doesn't have enough horsepower to overcome all of the drag caused by all the high lift devices on it.
Got it. That's very interesting.
So the combination of the additional weight of these things and the additional drag, it encourages you to buy your altitude at a very high cost. And I would argue you should do just the opposite. Look for a sail on altitude. The sail is at 73 miles an hour. Get there as quick as you can. Don't rotate like Ron did at the point where the plane will fly and impress people with how great your high lift devices are. Because then you are going to maybe never climb out of ground effect like he did. And if you do, it's like I said, it's at a very high cost.
And the thing I would say about this is because there's a lot of videos out there of people rotating and then climbing out at this high angle of attack.
Yeah.
And those people don't have loads. They're not carrying loads.
Right.
They're not working their airplane.
Yeah. And that's the difference probably too in my way of looking at things, because I made my living doing this. I didn't fly Cubs at air shows with 5 gallons of gas in them. Most of the time I was like, it's interesting that we didn't fly over gross much in Cubs. I'm sure I've flown a Cub over gross, but most of the time, you know, we had a Hunter and we always told them 50 pounds of gear and a rifle. Of course, they always show up with more than that, but we'd eyeball it, and if we thought the place we were going was adequate, we'd do it. But we're probably, most of the time, below gross weight. But when you're operating off of 250 feet, you can't be at over gross.
Yeah.
You got to be probably under gross, or you're not going to get in the air. Now, the other thing that to demonstrate this theory, there is a video that you can Google on the internet and find it. And then Google Antov 124. If you put in vodka burner Canberra, you'll probably turn it up. And it's a video of a AN 124. You know, the 4-engine, not the one that was the unique one that was blown up in Ukraine recently. It's the little brother of that. That's still a huge airplane. The 4-engine version of it. It's a video of it taking off in the Canberra airport in Australia. And I think it is a very instructive video. And I used to show it at my off-airport short field takeoff and landings. And you might wonder, wow, this is one of the biggest airplanes in the world. What are you taking off on a 10,000-foot runway? Why are you using it in an off-airport Super Cub show? But I think it demonstrates the things I'm talking about here in terms of, you know, every airplane has a short field.
Right.
You know, if you're in a Cub, it's 250 feet. If you're in a 185, maybe it's 500 feet. If you're in an AN 124, maybe it's 10,000 feet at gross weight.
Yeah.
But in this video, it's taken from the tower. And so the pilot comes out on the runway. He's cleared for takeoff. And he goes down the end of the runway, and he takes the nose wheel, and he points it at the corner of the runway, the end of the runway he's going to take off from. He literally puts the nose wheel over in that corner, and then that plane will turn really sharp. He brings it around. I mean, he leaves no pavement behind him. He puts that airplane as close to the end of the runway as it's possible to get one. And then he starts the takeoff roll. And the tower controller says, the vodka burner is on the roll. And about halfway down the runway, the controller says, you're going to have to go faster than that, Captain, if you want to get in the air. And the plane continues to go on down the runway. And about 3/4 of the way down the runway, the controller says, you can rotate anytime now, Captain. And that plane keeps going.
Yeah.
And it goes to the end of the runway. And at the end, but this time he's quite a ways away, and the camera's a little shaky, and he's got the telephoto out all the way. So it's a little hard to tell exactly where it is. But it appears in the video that at the end of the runway, he lifts the nose wheel. Just lifts the nose wheel, and the nose wheel runs off the end of the runway. And the mains are still on the ground. And then he continues to rotate, and just as he gets to the end of the pavement, the mains come off the pavement. And the controller's like, if I hadn't seen that with my own eyes, I wouldn't have believed it.
Yeah.
And the plane, and then Canberra is in the hills. It's not a real high altitude runway, I don't think. I've been there on a 100cc Honda, but there's hills around it. And he points at the top of the hills. And the two controllers are sitting there looking, and the one controller says, I'm not sure I've got enough tape to video the impact. Because it looks like he's not going to clear. And he eventually clears the hill. And you can see daylight between him and the hill when the video ends.
Wow.
But I think it is a great demonstration of a really well-executed short field takeoff. And is applicable to how you should be taking a Super Cub off on a gravel bar. Don't leave any runway behind you. Keep it on the runway to the end and aim at the top of the obstacle after you're in the air.
Perfect. Amazing. Great explanation. So what's the other thing?
So now we're in
Takeoffs?
the air. So the question
Okay.
is, how do you land?
Okay.
So, there's a bunch of stuff about how you figure out where to land, which may be a separate discussion in terms of figuring out, what you can land on. But let's assume that we're landing on a place that you've been on before. And the way I used to do this, I had a PowerPoint slide, and I would had a line on the PowerPoint, and I'm going to propose to you that this is a 10,000-foot runway. And you're the pilot of a Super Cub. It's my Super Cub. And I'm going to have a few pilots fly this Super Cub and land on this 10,000-foot runway. And there's only two things I'm interested in. If the tail wheel touches first, you're disqualified. You're done. But the person who can land the shortest from the distance from where the tires touch until they stop, I'm going to give the Cub to. You're going to have 15 minutes to go out there and make touch and goes. And whoever touches has the shortest from where the mains touch until they stop without touching the tail wheel first before the mains gets the airplane.
So
for
there's
free.
no line.
There's no line.
It just has to be somewhere on the 10,000 foot runway.
I'm just going to watch where the wheels hit and where they stop. Now tell me how you would make that. So you got 15 minutes. You can go out and make as many landings as you can in 15 minutes. How are you going to do it?
I think that I would.
There's no trick here. This is just common sense.
I think I would get over the runway, and I would get at as slow as I could. I'd probably be behind the power curve, and at some point when I felt like I was the slowest I could possibly get, without dropping and hitting the runway, I'd drop the flaps and the power as soon as I could and stop.
Yeah. Okay.
But I don't know.
Okay, so that one you made and you bounced and it took a little way. So now you're going to go around again and the clock's running. You got 15 minutes. How are you going to do the second one? First off, you take off. How are you going to fly the approach?
The approach?
Yeah, it's 10,000 foot runway. You're in the middle of it. Your clock's running. You got to get around. You can make maybe in 15 minutes. You can probably make 5-6 landings.
Yeah.
So how you take off? What speed you going to fly at, and so on.
Well, I would do like you said. I would fly about 70.
Yeah, so you're going to take off full power probably until you get around to final.
Right.
And then probably 70 miles an hour on final.
Sure.
Maybe a little slower, maybe 65 or something. But you're not going to be at 43, are you?
But I got 10,000 feet here,
Yeah. So you're going to come down at 70 miles an hour, say, it doesn't really make any difference.
Yeah.
In fact, you might, in this scenario, you might dive down at red line just to save time.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But at some point, when you get over the runway, you're going to start to slow up, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you're going to get in ground effect.
Yeah.
And you're going to keep slowing up. And you said you're going to be on the backside of the power curve at some point.
Yeah.
And you probably might actually add power. Because
Yeah,
you can fly
right.
a little slower, power
Yeah,
up. Now, you
yeah.
can't add a lot of power because you're on the Fairbanks runway and it's level. So if you add too much power, you're just going to
You're
fly
gonna
away
climb,
from it.
yeah.
But you're going to probably add as much power as you can to get as much of a power off stall as you can without touching the tail wheel, remember. I said you can't touch the tail wheel.
Yep.
So you can get down with the tail wheel an inch off the pavement and touch down in essentially a wheel landing. You're going to be flying with a little power on to get the stall speed as slow as you can. And as soon as those tires hit, you're going to jerk power off and hit the brakes.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, what I did at that point, I've got this line that represented the 10,000 foot runway, and then I'd show the next PowerPoint slide, and everything forward and backward of where you touch down to where you stop disappears.
Yeah.
I said, okay, now you're out on a gravel bar that's 250 feet long, where you just landed. Should your approach and landing be any different than it was on the 10,000 foot runway that you just landed on?
No, I would say no.
It shouldn't be any different, but I would argue that it is going to be, and the reason it's going to be is because I can't fly good enough to do what you just did
Right.
on a gravel bar.
Yeah.
But my point is that the speed you're at on a mile final or a half a mile final or a quarter mile final or frankly 100 feet from touchdown doesn't really make any difference. And you think about, you know, if this is your 250 foot gravel bar, you know, this is it here. If you're going to touch down right here on the end of this thing, you can't aim at that and then flare here, or you're going to touch down over here.
Yeah.
So you've got to aim, and if you looked at, you know, what you did, you were aiming over here.
Yeah.
You came down, got over the runway, got as slow as you could, got on the backside of the power curve, added power, and then touched down. So you're going to have to aim out here in the middle of the river. If you're landing on a gravel bar on the Robertson River, you're aiming in the water.
Yeah.
And you're going to flare out over the water. And you're going to add power over the water. And you're going to touch down right on the beginning of the runway.
So you got to have like you got to be mentally strong.
Yeah, well,
I mean, that's my thought here. Is
if you're, you know, the example I just gave where there's a river and there's a cut bank, and your landable area starts on that, you know, I don't have big enough kahunas to hit the end of that. I mean, I used to land in a place up on the Delta River that was just exactly like what I'm describing. And one time I came in there and landed. I mean, I went back and took a picture of it. I actually made a groove in the cut bank. But you know, you really, when I'm landing over a cut bank, it just makes you pucker up. Because if you're too low, it could be a bad scene. I've seen them all with the gear at the cut bank and the plane down the runway a little ways.
probably a pretty short landing on that one.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a short landing. But my point is that, you know, when you see people come in and they're, you know, hanging on a prop way back here half a mile before the touchdown, that's unsafe.
Right.
And to me, the difference between a really good Super Cub pilot and you said, what do you tell a beginning Super Cub pilot, is the distance that between, you know, how far you have to cheat being too slow back from the touchdown point. A really good pilot can come in fast, flare out, and just as he hits the runway, he reaches the minimum airspeed. I can't do that, never have been able to do that. I've always got to cheat 50, 100 feet back.
But that's kind of your goal, is what you're saying. That's
your goal is to come as close as, you know, you fly at 65 miles an hour in a Cub is perfectly safe.
Totally.
So fly your approach at 65 knots. Aim short of the runway. And when you're, you know, in the last 100, 200 feet before the runway is where you flare out add a little power, and touch down.
That's what Kirk Ellis was telling me. He's like, if you're flying in a river and you're turning on to final, you carry extra speed, and then you can slow it down if you know how to slow it down.
Yeah, it's the last, that last little bit, and how long that bit is, to me determines how well you know your airplane and your landing spot and your, that really tells me how good you are. If you can repeatedly come in there with a 65 miles an hour approach and do your flare and get on the backside of the power curve a couple hundred feet off the end of the runway and touch down right in the end, you're a good pilot. The other thing that I want to point out is this idea of if you touch down at the tailwheel first, you're disqualified. You see people with this baby bush wheel in the back of their airplane. I've never owned a baby bush wheel. I've always flown with this thing that's in the back of your airplane. And, to me, that is not part of the landing gear. That's to balance the thing on the ground.
That's a taxi gear.
Yeah, it's a taxi gear. It's not part of the landing gear. And you see people come in, high angle of attack, hit tail wheel first, and then once the tail wheel hits, then it's just going to slam the mains down, and you're almost invariably going to bounce. Maybe not a lot, but you're going to bounce.
Yeah. Well, that's why they have shocks.
Yeah. And you may not have much flying speed left, so you may not have much aerodynamic lift, but you've got something springy that's going to throw you back up in the air. And my point is, to me, the ideal landing, you touch down with the tail wheel 1 inch off of the ground. Now, could you fly slower if you touch down tail wheel first with the mains a foot in the air? And the answer to that is yes. Plane's going slower. Let's say it's going 3 miles an hour slower. It'd be interesting to do that calculation and see what it is. I don't think it's a lot. I think it's 2 or 3 miles an hour. And my point is, if I come in and I roll on in a wheel landing, the tail wheel never touches, when those tires hit, I immediately am relaxing, putting forward pressure to roll up onto the tires. So they hit and they just immediately starts turning, and so the inertia of spinning up the tires is immediately slowing you down. I'm immediately unloading the wing. 2 things are happening. The tail comes up, I can see where I'm going. And that's why I can fly on 24-10-6s instead of 35s, because I can dodge between the rocks. I see where the rock is, and I can go 6 inches from it because I've got control of the airplane. It's up on the mains. I'm not bouncing down through there. I've got brake control and rudder control, and I can see where I'm going. And I've got weight on the mains, so I can immediately brake. That 3-knot advantage, if it is, or 1 mile an hour, whatever it is, you're in the air bouncing, no brakes are on, you're not in contact with the ground. You've lost that advantage in the first 25 feet while you're in the air bouncing. So to me, it's not, the trick is the tail wheel is barely in the air. If you have a bush tail wheel on, your bush tail wheel is going to be on the ground because it's bigger in diameter than that thing.
Yeah, so you got to be a little
flatter. So you're probably going to land on it. You've lost the advantage, and you're going to be hitting on a part of the airplane that's not part of the landing gear.
Very instructive. I like that.
One thing I guess we should talk about is how this differs on a ridge, on steep terrain.
Okay, yeah.
There's a place called Naconda Creek. It's a creek that runs into the Nabesna River down near Orange Hill. And we ended up trading the Ellis brothers for the airstrip at Naconda Creek. They developed that initially, and we didn't know about it. But we were landing in a place that was causing them some trouble, and we made a horse trade, and we ended up in Naconda Creek. Naconda Creek is a very steep runway at a high altitude, but it's a really good place to hunt sheep.
Yeah.
And Naconda Creek is a place, when you think about it, if you're landing on a steep place, the distance, it seems like you're way too high. And these places are places where you absolutely can't go around. Even Ron couldn't go around here. So you cannot be too high. If you're too high, if you're almost low enough but too high, you can't go around. By the time you figure it out, you're screwed. So there's a tendency to want to get too low And the problem is if you get too low, you can't, even full power, you can't climb up to it. So you got to be really careful on especially steep runways to understand that you're going to be
altitude.
really high on short final, and to not get too low.
You are going to be high on short final.
You're going to appear to be high. You're going to be a long ways from the ground. You're high in the sense of you're a long ways from the
Okay.
ground, but you're not too high in the sense of being on the right approach slope.
Got it.
It seems obvious, but it's not until you're there and you realize you're too high or you're too low and you can't do anything about it that you realize, oh yeah. I remember
So are both high and low are bad, correct?
right.
Because if you're high, you can't go around anyway, so you're just kind of landing beyond the runway or something, right?
Right, or you're going to land too far up it. And
Yeah.
the good thing is on steep runways, you don't roll very far after you hit the ground. So it's
Okay, sorry for interrupting.
yeah.
So-
It's interesting how steep a place you can land on. I'll tell you a little story. This is back when I was going to school in Boston, and I used to come up in the fall and fly for a couple months. And Charlie and Ron were both flying, and I was taking some moose hunters out. And it was the end of September, and I don't know why I was in this situation, but I didn't have any place to put these guys. So I needed to find a new place to put them. So I went out empty, and this is another story we should talk about. You don't land in places like this with a load the first time. In this case, I didn't. I went by myself, found a place where there was moose. I knew there was moose there. It was a long ways from any place we could land. But the question was there any place to land? And we'd never landed here before. So I found a ridge that I thought we could land on, but it was very steep. But it looked smooth enough. And of course, you can't touch down going down. It's too steep to even roll your tires on. And once you land, you're committed. So I went in and landed empty by myself. And it was a place where you came in, you could touch down basically with probably half power. You'd come in, rotate, add power, and fly with a lot of power, maybe full power, if you're a little on the low side, and touch down. And as soon as you lost a little, once you were down to 15, 20 miles an hour, you'd go to full power and taxi as far as you could up the runway. And before it stopped moving, because it would under full power, you got to get it kicked around so you got enough power to turn your tail. But of course, you can't point all the way down, because if you do, you're not going to be able to hold it.
Take off again.
So the trick is to turn a little more than 90 degrees. You got to be turned like 135 degrees, so you're sideways, so you won't. And of course, the limit is at some point you're going to roll up on the wing. At that, so, if you turn sideways, it's going to roll up on the wing. This place was not that steep. And I dropped 200s off there, and the joke was that I dropped them off. I went back home, marked on the map where they were, and told Charlie and Ron I'm headed back to Boston. There's 200s there. And I guess, it was late in the year and the wind was a problem. And I must have been there on the perfect day with a little headwind to land. And they had a horrible time getting them out. We called it Steep Ridge, and I don't think it's ever been used again since. Guys got two moose they had to haul out of there.
Oh my gosh, they had to make like 6 trips or something.
Yeah. They never let me they never forgave me for that one.
Wow.
But, in talking about, we talked a little bit about this story about this idea that you should not land in a place that you've never landed before when you're loaded.
Yeah.
And this was in the late 80s, I guess. And Ron had some health issues at that time that eventually killed him. And I was going to school in Fairbanks, and I was coming down the weekends to fly, and I got down there Friday night, and they'd medevaced Ron to Anchorage. And so Ron and I were the only ones flying hunters at that time, and so I had twice as many hunters as I could haul that weekend. I was taking a hunter up on the Gersel River, and my plan was we had a place where we land at the mouth of 4th of July Creek, right near the base of the glacier on the Gersel River. So I had my girlfriend at the time, ex-wife now, drive one of the hunters up to the Gersel River Bridge, and I took the other hunters and I sent some gas up with her, and I was going to drop him off and fly back to the bridge, land on the road, pick up the other hunter, and then it's just like a 10-minute flight. And so, I can get twice as much done because I had twice as much to do. So I flew up there with the hunter, and I got there, and there was an airplane at a camp on my runway. And so I wasn't happy about that.
Yeah.
But we had a policy at that time, we guaranteed people we'd take them to a place where there wasn't any other hunters. So I decided that I was going to go up 4th of July Creek, which is where you hunted anyway, and find a place to land up the creek, which we'd never done. And a combination of things. I mean, I was angry that this guy was on my runway. Right. I was under pressure. Ron wasn't there. I had another hunter to haul. I had a bunch of more hunters to haul. I had a weekend. I was going to school. I mean, there was a lot of pressure to do this. And so I did what I knew I shouldn't do, and I never did, is I went up there with the hunter. And there was a lot of wind that day. And there was probably 30 knots of wind coming down July Creek. And I found a ridge on the right side of the July Creek. There was kind of a rounded ridge, parallel with the valley, and it was up on this side, and then it went down the other side. And I could see there was vegetation on it, and I thought it looked like blueberry bushes. I flew over kind of, a couple hundred feet in the air because it was really blowing hard, and I didn't want to get down low in the rounded part of the hill where it could force me down. So I flew over kind of high, looked at it, and I'm just crawling because, 30 knots of wind, I'm like bicycle speed going over it. And I'm thinking, yeah, that looks like blueberry bushes. I'll bet I can roll through that crap. So I came around and decided I was going to make a low pass and try and actually put my wheels on it. So I got down low enough, and I got in the waterfall on the downwind side of it, and it just like the big hand of heaven just forced me down. And so I'm coming down full power, and I'm just coming down. I can't pitch up anymore. You get down to minimum.
So you have a headwind, the hill's like this, the wind's blowing this direction, and you're coming in. When you say a waterfall, the wind's diving
down over the hill, and I'm
down.
Climbing into descending wind. And I'm, I've run out of airspeed or power to pay for altitude. So it's just taken my altitude, and I'm headed for the hill. So, there's really nothing you can do in that situation. Your bad decision to do this is now going to test your expert pilot skills to see whether you're going to be able to get out of this bind.
How was that?
And the only thing I could see to do is just to stay full power, hit the hill, keep the full power on it, and try and run off the other end of it and get back in the air. And the problem was, as I got down that angle, I realized that these are not blueberry bushes. This is dwarf birch. And it's, this high, and it's the size of my thumb. It's going to create a lot of drag when I hit. So I hit, and then the next thing I noticed was, lurking up in the dwarf birch at the other end that I'm aiming right at is a rock about twice the size of the chair that you're sitting in. Jeez. Kind of like a refrigerator on its side, sitting at the other end of where I'm going to have to go.
Hey guys, we'll get right back to the interview, but first, let's talk about the easiest way that you can support us in making more content like this. One of the most overlooked weight savings you can do on your aircraft is seat upholstery. In addition to losing an average of 5 pounds and as much as 45 pounds in extreme cases, redoing your seat upholstery will make you more comfortable while you're flying, add value and curb appeal, and can even have added safety margins. We'll talk about the safety features in another video, but for now, let's focus on weight savings. Some old aircraft were built when the upholstery and foam technology was, well, still using horsehair for cushion material. Not to mention that a lot of seats have several layers of upholstery stacked on top of each other. All this can add up to significant weight savings. This customer saved 8 pounds on just his Cessna 170 pilot and co-pilot seats. This customer saved 11 pounds on his Super Cub seats.
We just put these seats in Jack's Cub. We saved, what did we save?
11 pounds.
11 pounds.
Scotia over 11 pounds.
That's pretty awesome.
And this customer saved nearly 20 pounds just on his 180 bench seat. Click the link in the video description or go to sportaircraftseats.com to find out more.
Lurking up in the dwarf birch at the other end that I'm aiming right at is a rock about twice the size of the chair that you're sitting in, kind of like a refrigerator on its side, sitting at the other end of where I'm going to have to go. So there's this horrible racket when I hit, the gear on a Super Cup sounds like when it's going over stuff you shouldn't be on.
And what kind of tires are you on?
I'm on the 24-10-6 Guy Selman tires. And so just before I get to this rock, I rotate, pull the flaps on, full flaps, and it lifts off. And I stay in ground effect, and I just head down the other side of the ridge in ground effect. I mean, like really close ground effect. And I mean, literally, the stick is doing this in my crotch, it's just...
Meaning you're that
I'm
close to a
burbling.
stall.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's burbling over the elevator. So, I got nothing else I can do. Just stay in ground effect, full power, ride it down the hill and see what happens. And eventually, as I went down the side of the hill, I got flying, got back to one notch of flaps, and got climbing. But the problem is now I'm in the bottom of the valley, climbing into this wind up a valley. This is like your nightmare. This is when you wake up in the middle of the night, like, oh
I've
my
had
God.
that nightmare.
Yeah. So I'm trying to gain some altitude on the right side to where I might be able to make a left turn. And I finally got enough altitude I thought I could make it. And I made the turn and I got out of there. And, my heart's just pounding in my chest. And I'm thinking, that was really close. And then I looked out the window, and here's the left wheel lodged up between the struts. And I had hit that rock with the left gear. And that gear, it was a Wagearo gear. This is back when we changed from the 1.5-inch axle to the 1.25-inch to the 1.5-inch. And I bought a gear from Wagearo, and I don't know what they made it out of, but it wasn't 4130, I don't think. And I had bent the gear previously, just put a little wow in the back leg, and my mechanic had welded a sleeve over the top of it, straightened it out and welded this sleeve. So the sleeve started about 6 inches up from the axle. Well, right where that sleeve started, it was strong after that, but that's where it just doubled the gear over. And the wheel was up touching the strut. Fortunately, it didn't bend the strut. So I'm headed back to Tanacross, and I didn't have a electrical system or an intercom, so I told the hunter we're headed back to Tanacross. It's kind of funny because about halfway back, he all of a sudden grabs the whole back of my seat and pulls up and he says, "Are we going to have a problem landing at Tanacross?"
Like he had just seen it or something?
I mean, he was just thinking about it, the sheep hunt he couldn't go on, and all of a sudden you realize, we don't have a gear on the left side. Well, it was Labor Day weekend, and now
He's probably just sitting back there going, damn it, I'm going to miss out.
yeah.
Whoa!
Yeah, maybe he didn't notice that. I mean, I don't
Yeah.
know, because I didn't tell him. I just said, we're going back to Tanacross. And so anyways, Labor Day weekend, and at that time, a bunch of a sports car club from Anchorage would come up to Tanacross and race around this triangular arrangement with sports cars. Mm-hmm. So I get back there to Tanacross, and there's like hundreds of people from Anchorage racing around the runway where I need to land. So I made a few passes, and they got the drift. Oh, the guy only got one gear leg. And so my plan was to land on the pavement and then roll it up on the right gear leg as far as I could and pull a mixture, kill the prop. I didn't have a battery, so wherever the prop stopped was where it was going to be, and I was hoping it was going to stop sideways, which it did, surprisingly.
Wow.
And then I figured I'll run off the end of the runway, and because I'd done a ground loop there 20 years before, I knew that all this loose gravel, I figured I could kind of loop around, try and ground loop to the left, and the inertia would keep that wing up until eventually I ran out of airspeed. Well, it's hard to ground loop to the left when you don't have a left gear leg or a left brake to get it started. But I did, just with the steerable tail wheel, I was able to get a pretty good curve going, and it stayed up for a long ways, and then finally the wing came down and the end of the gear dug in and it nosed up, wing was on the ground, and the cowl scratched up the cowl and the end of the wing a little bit, but the prop was straight because it was straight across, and we took the gear off my brother's airplane and put it on my airplane, and I went up and flew hunters. But the moral of the story is do not land in places you've never been with a load.
Because if you'd been light there, it would have been a lot different story. If you had 200-300 pounds less in your plane.
Yeah. If I'd been light, I might have been able to climb out of the descending wind. Probably a good chance I would have climbed out of the descending wind. And even if I couldn't do that, I probably wouldn't have hit the rock. I might have made a hell of a racket and torn up some fabric going through the dwarf birch. But I might not, because I just barely hit the rock, you know.
Yeah, and this goes back to that thing I think that you said about being good or lucky. There's a lot of luck involved, and you're trying to figure out with your strategies and your rules how to keep from having to use your luck.
Right. I mean, I should never have been there in the first place.
Yeah.
If I'd listened to my rules, I would never have been there in the first place. So it's, you know, when you see things piling up against you, that's when you need to look at the orange dot, realize this is a situation where I need to, you know, I'm going to wreck the airplane. How am I going to do it? If I had had that mentality at that point, if I had thought about, I'm going to wreck the airplane here. If I'd actually made that decision as I was on final, I'm going to wreck the airplane, how could it happen? I probably would have aborted that approach because I would have realized, yeah, I really am going to wreck the airplane here. This is a really bad idea. I could easily have hit that rock hard enough, it would have stopped me right there.
Yeah.
I could have gone down the other side and stalled out and killed us both
Yeah, you
going
could
down
have
the other side.
spun it while you're trying to climb out of the valley.
Yeah, I might have tried to make the turn too early and stalled and
You said something earlier that I just kind of wanted to like highlight, which was, I can't remember exactly the phrasing you used, but it was so excellent. Your stupid decisions have put you in a position that that now you have to use your superior piloting skills.
Right. I think there's a saying kind of like that.
Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. If you weren't so stupid, then you wouldn't have to be such a good pilot. But because you got yourself in this mess, I mean, that's a great example where it was a really stupid decision that got me into a situation where combination of I probably did a decent job of flying and had some good luck. Got me out of it. But it was very close.
So we've got the takeoff, we've got the landing, we've got the don't land when you're looking for a place to land, don't do it with a load. What's the what else is there kind of that you would give your student?
One of the reasons that we were as successful at 40 Mile Air as we were doing the things we did, and we basically never wrecked any airplanes doing this stuff. And if you went and looked, if you'd gone out with us as a hunter and watched some of the stuff we were doing, you would be amazed that we could pull it off without wrecking airplanes. But the reason we could was because these places that we were landing, we landed over and over and over. So, you know, when you went in there as a hunter, and the one time you went hunting with us, and the one time you landed there, it looked amazing. But the thing is, we'd done it so many times that we knew that place well. I think the disadvantage for a lot of private pilots is, you know, you get your cub, you're going out hunting, you've maybe never been in that area, you don't know where to land, you see the moose, now the place materializes to land, you're all excited about the hunt, you got your buddy with you in the back, you got both your packs, you got enough gas to, you know, lots of times I think private pilots doing this kind of stuff are in a lot worse situation. I mean, if you put me in that situation, I'd wreck the airplane too. First time I've landed there, I got a load, I've never been there, and you got a bad attitude. You're thinking about hunting rather than the fact, I'm gonna wreck an airplane here. You're there to have fun and go on the hunt, whereas I was always there, I'm making money. If I wreck the airplane, if I just bend my gear, I've destroyed the profit of this. So I've got a very different perspective.
The experience of knowing the strip that you're going into and knowing the area and all that is such a tremendous advantage.
The other thing I think is that lots of times a private pilot isn't doing that much flying. I mean, you look at me now. I've got a really nice Carbon Cub. I bought it in 2013, 11 years ago. I've got about 500 hours on it.
Right.
Do the math on that. I'm not flying enough. I shouldn't even be in an airplane. And the only good thing is I know that. I don't go and do the stuff I'm talking about now. I used to do that. I used to be able to do that. I fly my Carbon Cub between one good runway and another one. I don't land in anything you couldn't land a 206 on.
Can you talk about that currency? It kind of scares me when people are like, "Oh yeah, I've been flying for 15 years and I have 300 hours."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Well, what? Like, so you're telling me you just go rent an airplane and then you go fly?" That's got to be like the scariest thing to me.
Yeah, and even when I was doing this for a living, mostly during the year we were flying other things, 206s, 207s, 1V5s, Beavers, Otters, Buccaneers, various things. So most of the Cub flying we did that was off airport was just in August and September. The Cub flying that I did the rest of the year was mostly recon flying, where you're flying a Cub, but you're not landing anyplace. You're doing moose counts and sheep counts and stuff. You're flying around. Very different kind of, very different skill set. But even when I was flying, 1,200 hours a year doing that, at the beginning of hunting season, before hunting season started, I'd get in my Cub and go out and land on these places that I'd landed last year. I'd practice. I mean, I'm flying 100, 150 hours a month. I'm going out and practicing. And I'd go out to these places, and of course in the beginning of August, it's always hot and windy, it's not great conditions. But you go out there and look at these things, and you're like, my God, did I land here last year with a load? I can't get on here empty. So, currency is a huge deal. Even if you're doing this for a living, you're flying all the time, year to year, I would be out of currency. And, a lot of the places that when we were developing new places, we did at the end of hunting season. Because at the end of September, it's cold. On a good day in September when the wind's not blowing and it's cold, and you've flown 200 hours in the last 2 months in a Cub, all off airport, I mean, you're sharp. You can hit that cut bank and not even pucker up.
Yeah.
But you go out in August on a hot day when you haven't been doing it for 10 months, and you can't hit it within 100 feet.
I do think there's a place where, people, they kind of go, well, I'm just really conservative because I'm not current. It's like, well, that's good, but I also think if you're going to even call yourself a pilot, you need to maintain some level of currency.
Yeah.
Not just fall back on I'm just going to be more conservative. It's good to be more conservative, but you need to get out and fly.
Yeah.
Because even if you're conservative, you might take off one day and the wind picks us up while you're flying, and now you've got to land in a crosswind.
Right.
Then what do you do then?
Right.
What do you think about that? I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, when I used to do the off-airport talks for the FAA, what I used to tell people is, at the beginning of hunting season or whenever you're going to go do this kind of stuff, I was in Fairbanks there, I said, go out on the Tanana River. There's lots of really good sandbars on the Tanana River. Go out and find a really good sandbar, land, get out, and, find a stick, piece of driftwood, and mark, a runway with a neck in it that's just as wide as your gear and has a dog leg in it. And because that's probably what you're going to be landing on for real.
Yeah.
And it's better, even if there's some real wows there, it's better to wreck your airplane or do something that needs some repairs 5 miles from Fairbanks International than in the Brooks Range. That's if you don't want to do your testing in the Brooks Range where nobody knows where you're at and so on. So, and when we talk about narrow necks and this idea about how you pick out places to land.
Yeah.
On gravel bars, the hardest thing for me is you can fly over something and say, oh, I think I can land right through there. And, I got to go dodge that rock and go a little bit there and so on. But then when you come around again and get down low and line up, you can't even see it. You can't see where the touchdown point is, or if you touch down on it, turns out you're not lined up. You can see the touchdown point, but you touch down on it and you realize, oh, I'm out of alignment 20 degrees, and you're going off through the rough.
Yeah.
So that's a real art form to try and figure out how to, and what I try and do is find a sandy place in the gravel bar where I can make tire tracks that I can see, and B, now you've got a width reference. You know how wide your gear is.
Yeah.
And sometimes you touch down and make 2 gear tracks and fly up and look at it and say, yeah, it's only about 4 times as long as the width of my gear,
Right.
This is probably not any place I'm going to land.
That's funny.
So you get some frame of reference. And the other thing is that I like to categorize a landing spot by 3 categories. Here's some place that I can operate off from. It's good, I can land on, take off, and I'm not going to do any damage. Here is stuff that I don't want to be landing through. I might rip my tailwheel off if I go through here, but I'm probably not going to wreck the airplane. It's going to be rough, but it's landable.
So this is a different category. The first category is usable for commercial.
This is good usable stuff. You're not going to scare the.
So that's
the customer.
category 1 or whatever.
Yeah, this is you need 250 feet of that. But then if there's another 100 feet that's rough, but you're not going to wreck the airplane probably.
Got it.
You might throw a rock through the stabilizer or something. That counts as stuff in the pocket that you could roll out on. As compared to, for example, there's a cut bank and the Robertson River, the main channel is right there. If you run over that, maybe it's really good sandbar for 250 feet and then it ends at a cut bank in the main channel of the river. That's scary stuff.
Yeah.
If you screw up there, you wreck your airplane, probably going to drown.
Right.
So that all of a sudden that 250 feet isn't really usable, and you probably can't even use it from the other end because landing into a cut bank, that's going to cost me at least 50 feet. I mean, most of the time I'm not that sure about being able to clear that cut bank. I'm going to be 6 inches up. And that's going to cost me the first 50 feet of the runway.
You don't want to bank on that 50 feet.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So now I need a 300-foot place to land on.
Let me look at my notes because there was a couple of stories that I really liked that you told. And
There's always, if you want an entertainment story, there's Charlie landing on top of the car. That's a good story.
why did Charlie? Yeah. What do you mean he landed?
So at this time, there was no runway as such in Tok that was maintained. There was 2 private runways there. One was called the Tok Lodge Strip, but it was not maintained and nobody had any land status on it.
Yeah.
And the old Rudy Hartzell runway, which is now the Tok runway, but
Yeah.
it was privately owned and Rudy charged to land on it, so we never used it. So we always landed on the road south of Tok. And 2 miles out of Tok was where Bob and Alice and Mary Roberts lived, and they had the Chevron bulk plant, and they were our fuel supplier and our good friends. So we used them like a base of operations in Tok initially. So we would land on the road right by their driveway and then pull into their driveway and use their phone and drink coffee there or whatever. When you come right up there, you just look right and left and see if there's any cars coming. If not, you just turn final and land, pull into their driveway. And so Charlie's in a 206, and he's got 5 people on board coming back from Tatlin, and he comes up, looks left and right, and he doesn't see anything, so he turns on the final and proceeds to land. Well, as he's getting down, really low, Larry Hand, it turns out, was right underneath him, right in front of him when he comes up and he looks both left and right, and you need to kind of, as you're turning, keep your eye down there to make sure that what's underneath the nose, there's not a car there.
Yeah.
But he missed that. And so Larry is driving down the road and all he hears this kind of low-pitched rumble. And he looks in his rearview mirror and he sees a orange and white 206 descending on the top of his international travelall. So he hits the gas because it's crawling up on him and it's right on him. And so he hits the gas. And Larry starts to pull away and Charlie touches down on top with the nose wheel up probably right over the top of Larry's head. But Larry's going a little bit faster than Charlie at this point, so he starts pulling away and Charlie rolls backwards down the top of the carryall, and then he gets to the back and the nose wheel falls off the back of the airplane and it goes down, and of course the prop is 4 feet ahead of the nose wheel. So it starts whacking slices through the top of the travel wall, but Larry's pulling away, so the slices are about 4 or 5 inches apart. Whack, 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 whack. He made about 6 or 8 slices through the top of the travel wall, and then Charlie slid off the back and landed.
Did he know when he touched down in the car? Was he aware? Did you ever ask him?
I don't know. My brothers, and Charlie was very different than Ron. He looked different than us. He's blue-eyed blonde and very jovial, smiled all the time. He was a cool kid. But things like this, you don't talk about a whole lot.
Okay.
And of course, this is another case where, now the FAA got involved and Charlie lost he got his license suspended for 90 days. Of course, everybody, they're all our friends. I mean, Mom and Dad taught school there. I actually lived in Tatlin the first 3 years of my life. So these are all we know everybody. So of course, Charlie told everybody, tell the FAA that the engine quit.
Yeah, because there's you got
They're
marks.
still windmilling. But the FAA was like, no, we're not buying that. We're taking your license for 30 days.
That's crazy. Do you want to close out by telling us what happened to your leg, or because you were talking about that? Do you want to share that?
Which story of my leg
The
going?
initial one,
The initial one, yeah.
the airplane related one.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So in 1981, the state of Alaska was doing aerial wolf control. So they were shooting with fish and game biologists, shooting wolves from the air, doing wolf control in the 40-mile area. And I don't morally agree with shooting wolves from the air, and so I refused to fly them. But of course, that didn't stop them from doing wolf control there. They were doing wolf control out of Fairbanks too. So they were bringing pilots down from Fairbanks that would do this. And we didn't like that, pilots in our country.
Right.
And I kind of looked at it, like I say, I do flying for money. I made a living doing it, and I'm looking at it and I'm like, look, these guys they're gonna go out and shoot wolves anyway. So whether me saying I'm not going to do it isn't going to prevent it from happening. And what I observed after a while, listening to their stories, was it's hard to shoot wolves in the 40-mile because there's a lot of timber. And the wolves that we're shooting, the packs were radio collared. So the alpha male and alpha female are radio collared. They've been tracked down, darted with a helicopter, and they have radio collars on them. So you could go out, locate the pack, and then the way to do it is to shoot the ones that are not radio collared first.
Right.
You don't want to shoot your radio collared ones.
Yeah.
And the way they were doing it is they'd start shooting at one, and of course the wolves head for the timber. And once they get in the timber, you really can't kill them in the timber. And and then they'd say, okay, well, we got that one's wounded. We'll go after this one that's still in the open. So I went to him and I said, look, I'll fly for you under two understandings. One is that I'll fly with a gunner that I know is good, and we will practice so we can hit stuff. And two, if we shoot at a wolf, we will kill it even if we lose the rest of the pack. So those are the ground rules. And Danny Grandgard was the gunner. And Danny he was a trapper and hunter. That was his profession. And he was a technician worked for the Fish and Game there. And he, really, he couldn't ask for a better gunner.
Yeah.
And so we would go out and, in the beginning, we would take balloons and blow them up and land and put them on a lake and then take off. And, the balloons, just with a little bit of wind, would blow across the lake. And then we'd make passes on them and see if we hit the balloons. And we did that until he could, hit stuff. And shooting wolves from the air, I don't know if you've ever done it or shot at stuff from the air, but
I've never shot wolves from the air, no.
yeah. You ever shot out of an airplane at all?
No. No, I haven't.
Well, it's a dicey business. I mean, it's another one of these things that my dad had told, had always said, never shoot wolves from the air. Dad would never have done it, so it was a stupid thing to do. It's
Because
kind
he
of like,
thought it was dangerous?
yeah, it is dangerous. And it's kind of in the category of landing with a load on a ridge you've never been on. It's just not something you should do. It's just a really stupid idea. And but Danny was very good. And, the problem is if you shoot too early, you're shooting with a 12 gauge shotgun out of the back seat and with the door open. And if you shoot too far to the left, you shoot the end off the propeller. And if you shoot too far to the right, you shoot the struts off. So you've got an area here you can shoot.
Yeah.
And the problem is that if you're tracking a wolf, it's easy to track right across the strut just as you hit the trigger. And so you want somebody that understands the importance of the front strut and the prop, and it's a good shot. And this is a high-tech maneuver. And the other thing is, when you're approaching on a wolf, you can fly at it, but when you get really close to it, it's going to cut right or left.
Right.
And so you want to fly. You can only shoot if it cuts right. So you got to fly a little bit to the left. So you trick the wolf into thinking, I got to, they're to the left of me. I got to cut right. So they cut the only place. And you think about the lags and leads and stuff that you need to be able to do this. It sounds like it'd be easy to hit something with a shotgun, but it's really difficult.
Yeah.
And you've got to hit a wolf pretty square to kill it.
Right.
And you've got to be close. I mean, my experience was that if you didn't have the wolf within the end of the wing of the airplane, I mean, you had to be right on him to kill him.
Yeah.
And
So you're like how high? 10 feet off the ground or something?
yeah, ideally, you're right on him.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's why you can't kill them in the trees. Even if it's low spruce trees and they're only 15 feet high,
It's too risky. And
you can't get low enough, and then you're shooting through the trees. I mean, it just doesn't work. You got to have them in the open. So anyway, it was New Year's Eve, 1981, and there's not a lot of light that time of year, and but the weather was pretty good that day. It was reasonably warm, and so we took off in the morning and flew up into the 40-mile country. And it's not like you can file a flight plan where you're going because you're tracking wolves.
Yeah.
So we found this pack of wolves up near Mount Ketchimastuck, and they were up in open terrain, and so we started after one and shot at it, and we had hit it, and it went into a draw. We were up fairly high above tree line, and it went in this draw, so we're shooting going downhill down this draw, and we'd shot at it only a couple of times, I think, 2 or 3 times maybe. But anyway, we're flying down, shooting, and then coming back up, and I'm climbing back up and circling and making the turn in the exact same area in that draw each pass. And, I'm trying to get around there quickly before the wolf gets away from us. And we hit our wake turbulence, and the wing went down, it turned about a quarter of a turn and went straight into the side of the mountain. I mean, we were only, I don't know, probably 50, 75 feet in the air where we were making the turn. So I remember I literally said, oh shit, and then we hit. That was pretty much it.
Jeez.
Well, we were both knocked out, of course. And when I came to, you could still hear snow sizzling on the engine, and the wings were pretty much crushed down. There's fuel running out of the wing roots. So I crawled out and tried to stand up, and I was like, "Wow, how can I stand up?" And then I realized I had on Sorel boots, and they were like bent over at 90 degrees. like my ankle is toast. It kind of felt like standing in Jell-O with walnut shells in it. And what's interesting is how your body closes down. I mean, you'd think the pain would have been just excruciating when you stand on your ankle, and it was, my tibia and fibula were busted, my ankle was crushed, the rudder pedal went up through my ankle. But I remember it's just kind of like the sensation, like, wow, it's like standing on broken walnut shells down there. It's kind of an odd sensation, I can't stand on that leg. And Danny's knocked out in the airplane, and he comes to, and he was trapped in there. His leg was broken, and his back was, I won't say it was broken, but he had cracked vertebrae, and
Oh man.
so I got him pried out.
You pulled him out? I mean, obviously.
Yeah, his leg was trapped behind the seat. He was leaning out to shoot, and so his upper body, crushed the door frame down, and it was kind of.
Jeez.
And I didn't have a shoulder harness on. That airplane didn't have shoulder harnesses, and I had a helmet on, so that just added weight to my head and just drove my head into the panel, and so my jaw was. I thought it was broken, but as they told me later in the hospital, I said, it feels like it's broken in more than one place. He said, yeah, there's 11 pieces. I mean, it just shattered my lower jaw.
Jeez.
And I was wearing glasses, and so, it cut up my face pretty good. And I remember when I got Danny pulled out, and he had a broken leg, and I had a broken leg, so we were kind of a useless pair. And Danny's looking at me. I had on a refrigerator suit, and he said there was blood just running down out of my face down the front of the refrigerator suit. And he said, "We better, get some kind of shelter together before we go into shock." And I'm like, "Oh, we're not in that bad a shape. We're not going to go into shock." And he said, "If you could have seen yourself when you sit down, you didn't look good."
He's looking at you going, this guy's about to go into shock.
Yeah, this guy doesn't look good. So I had 2 down sleeping bags, good down sleeping bags, and some survival gear, and a 5-gallon can of gas, all in the baggage compartment. And so we're up above tree line on this mountain, and there's really no cover anywhere, and our mobility range is pretty limited. We're in waist deep snow.
Yeah.
So we're crawling around on our knees in the snow. So we didn't go very far from the airplane, and I had the motor cover with me, and so we laid the motor cover out, laid the sleeping bags out on top of it, and crawled into the sleeping bags. And this was about noon, I guess, on New Year's Eve. Well, nobody expected us to come back till dark, so nobody thought anything about it.
Yeah, so you guys are pretty much spending the night. You know that in your head at that point.
Yeah. We know nobody's even going to look, and nobody did look. And besides, it's New Year's Eve, so everyone went to a New Year's Eve party.
Oh, jeez.
Literally. So we're up there, twiddling our thumbs, and nobody even bothered to come looking until the next morning. And I had this is early in the life of ELTs, and I had an ELT in the airplane. And I also had one of the little EBC cigarette, it looks like a pack of cigarettes with an antenna that you pull out. Have you ever seen one of those? It's a portable ELT. It's not legal. It doesn't have a G switch on it. But I had one of those in my survival gear. And so the next morning, well, the first thing I thought is, I should probably crawl back down to the airplane and manually turn that. I mean, we hit pretty dang hard, but I thought
make sure it's on. Or
I should make sure that switch is on. So the next morning, I crawled on my hands and knees down to the airplane, which is maybe 75 feet away, and after I got out of the airplane, I had gotten my Swiss Army pocket knife out, opened up the battery compartment on the airplane, and turned the switch on that ELT.
You had already done it.
Yeah, I don't remember doing it.
Crazy.
But apparently, in between when I got out of the airplane, before I got Danny out, I had gone back, had presence of mind enough to get that, because when I got there, the battery cover was off, and the switch was manually
So
on.
this is like the good side of the bullets being laid neatly on the tape. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, apparently I realized that was important, and I did it, and I have no memory of doing it. Didn't then and don't now. And so I had this other ELT, and I'm thinking, should I turn it on? I thought, it can't hurt. So I turned it on, pulled the antenna out, and I stuck it in my refrigerator suit because, to keep the battery warm, and zipped it up. So I just had the antenna sticking out. And at some point, we heard airplanes. In fact, some airplanes flew close enough we saw them, but they didn't see us. And I had this 5-gallon can of gas, and so when one time we heard an airplane, I mean, it was going to fly right over us. And so I had a pan in my survival gear, a little aluminum pan, and I poured a bunch of gas in that. And there was one spruce tree that was about this high that was fairly close to where we were at. So I'm throwing gas on the spruce tree, and Danny was a smoker, so he had a cigarette lighter, and he lit the spruce tree. So, we got a flash of gas. But the airplane didn't see it. So I'm pouring more gas, and I'm throwing the gas across the sleeping bags onto the tree to get more flame. Well, the gas started dribbling back across the sleeping bags, and all of a sudden the sleeping bags caught fire. I mean, if you hadn't been there to videotape this, I'm sure it would have been, it was a good show, because here these two guys are all busted up and stiff, and their sleeping bags are on fire. The airplane never saw us. They just flew on and left.
Are you kidding?
Yeah. Well, at some point later, I rolled over and broke the antenna off from that
That ELT.
ELT. And this is late in the afternoon on the next day. So we've been there for like over 24 hours at this point.
So were you able to spend the night in those sleeping bags?
Yeah.
So
It was the first night it was reasonably warm. I mean, it was, considering it was the end of December. I don't know what the temperature was, but it wasn't super cold. It wasn't below zero. And it was fairly clear. It was pretty pleasant for that time of year.
That's not how I describe it. Yeah, it was fairly pleasant. We watched the stars. We both had broken legs, severed jaw. Okay.
So the antenna breaks off, and I'm thinking, that's too bad. And then I'm thinking, I wonder if I should try and do something about this. And, I don't know. It seemed like it was important. So, and I had a Swiss Army pocket knife with me, and there's a little tree nearby, piece of brush. So I whittled a piece of stick, and because it's a collapsible antenna, it's hollow inside. So I stuck one of the end of the stick whittled it so it fit inside the stub on the ELT, jammed the antenna on top of it, and made contact with the two metal ends of the antenna, and I held it there. And that's what they found us with.
Wow.
The problem was that when they took off the next morning, they immediately heard the ELT as soon as they left Tok, because we're 80 miles from there, but we're up 4,000 feet in the air. They could hear the ELT everywhere. The problem was they couldn't tell where it was coming from.
Yeah, of course.
Because they couldn't shadow it because we're on top of a frickin' mountain. So they could hear it everywhere, but they didn't know where it was. So they spent some time flying around trying to locate it, and finally they called CAP in Fairbanks, and they had a 207 with differential antennas on it. That you could switch between, so you could tell which side of the airplane it was on. So they called CAP, and CAP came out with the 207. Because, of course, by this time it's late afternoon, and they were tracking it, and it turned out the ELT in the airplane never worked. And they were tracking the little EBC antenna when I broke it off. And he said they're tracking it. All of a sudden there's no signal. Strong, and all of a sudden there's no signal.
Man.
And he said about 10, 15 minutes later, it comes back on. And that's what they found us with,
Wow.
holding that antenna together.
Jeez.
So it always pays to, kind of belt and suspenders, do everything you can in these situations because if I hadn't had that other ELT, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I mean, I don't know. I asked Danny, because like I said, Danny was a trapper and a hunter, and I asked him, I said, how long do you think we'll survive? Because I figured, he's seen a lot of animals die in traps in the wintertime. We're kind of like an animal
basically
in a
the
trap.
same. Yeah.
So he should have a pretty good idea how long we're going to survive. And he said, we'll make 5 days. So I think we can make 5 days. So I was like, well, guess we're going to live 5 days. And
What did you learn from that experience? Like in life in general, did you come away with it with?
Well, several things. One thing I think from a flying standpoint that's really important to think about. We crashed because we hit our wake turbulence at a low airspeed at a low altitude. And I think that there's a lot more of that goes on than you realize. There's a guy by the name of Joe Furman. You ever heard of him? Joe Furman was flying a fish and game biologist over on the south side of the Yukon Flats on a day in November when it was dead calm and overcast, and and he was circling some moose in fairly flat country, and he stalled and crashed and killed them both. And the question is, how can a highly experienced pilot like that, the argument is, well, he got going too slow and he stalled and crashed. You're like, no, Joe was smarter than that.
Yeah.
And I think when you think about it,
There was a guy this fall that did that same thing.
Yeah.
And-
This happens all the time with highly experienced pilots where you find them dead in an airplane that stalled and hit the ground. And I talked to you about, I used to fly Gordon Haber, and Gordon followed wolves. And it was fun flying because you're out flying radio-collared wolves, and then you just fly over them, watch what they're doing, watch them kill stuff and things. We spent hours orbiting them. But it was dangerous flying because what Gordon wanted to do was track a radio-collared wolf. When you find it, you're up fairly high, and then we would spiral down. And at some point, you get to a minimum altitude, so you were descending, and at some point, you start descending slowly. And when you think about it, there's like when you do a steep turn and you fly into your wake turbulence. You've done that. You do it every time you do a steep turn, right?
Yeah.
You're that good. You hit your wake turbulence every time.
Sure, every time.
I can't do it, but I'm sure you can.
Yeah, I'm right there.
So when you are spiraling down like that, your ears from your wake turbulence is descending off your wing, but if you're spiraling down, you're going below it because you're descending each time. But at some point, you start to flatten out, and you start descending at exactly the same rate as your wake turbulence. And next time you're going to hit it. And I think that there's a lot more accidents that are a result of wake turbulence in exactly that kind of situation. And the times that it happens are when it's dead calm, those days when you feel like you could get out and walk on the air. Because that's when you're willing to fly really close to stall speed, really low, orbiting something really close. And those are, I think that's what happened to Joe Furman.
So you could be going 60 in a Cub, for example, and you're like, I'm well above where I need to be, and you're in a turn, but you run in your wake turbulence, and it's like hitting a wall or having a carpet ripped out from under
And
you.
I don't think it's 60. 60 you're probably going to survive it, but it's when you're doing 45 or 50 that that you're really slow, and you're comfortable being really slow because it's just dead calm and cold air, and you're just motoring along. It's great, and then all of a sudden, wham! And it's when you hit it with one wing too, because that's what happened to us. You're going to get we did a quarter turn spin before we hit the ground. And so anyway, that's one of the things I learned. The other thing, you think about from a life standpoint, from where we were sitting, I could see the mountains 80 miles away and back of Tanacross, the profile of the Alaska Range that we used to fly across at 7,000 feet and then spin down to Tanacross. I could see that profile, the same profile I could see out the living room windows of my house at Tanacross. And as you're sitting there, you're realizing, until we got rescued, we assumed you're going to die there. Nobody really knew where we were. We'd seen airplanes fly over and they didn't see us. We weren't going to survive forever. And, the second night, started getting cold, the wind started to blow, it started to snow, and the snow was hitting on the sleeping bags, and our body heat was melting it, so the sleeping bags were getting wet. It was... So, and Danny said, he said, we won't make the night here. We've got to get cover. So, and he really couldn't do anything. So I crawled downhill to where there was a little bunch of spruce trees, maybe as high as that light. There's about maybe 8 or 10 of them. So I went down there and I had an axe. And I cut those spruce trees down. I dug a hole in the snow and lined it with the spruce trees. And then we drug the motor cover down there. And we got down in a hole where we could We didn't really have any cover, but we were down at least out of the wind, where we had some protection from the wind. And a funny story where I'd lost a lot of blood. And so that night, the second night, I was realizing, I was like dehydrated. Now, dehydration might get me. And I had a can of Pepsi that was frozen at this point that I'd had in the airplane. And so Danny was sleeping, and I decided I was going to melt that can of Pepsi. So we're down in this hole, and all our gear is up on the edge, up above us, and I got this 5-gallon can of gas up there in this pan. So I poured some gas into the pan and lit it and opened the Pepsi can and put it in the middle of the can of gas. Very well, melt it out. And so while I'm sitting there waiting for the Pepsi can to melt, all of a sudden I look and I realize that this red plastic 5-gallon can is fairly close to the pan with the fire. And all of a sudden I see the plastic above the line of gas in the can start to cave in. And, all this gas is going to run down in the hole. So I grabbed a handful of snow and I'm gingerly, trying to set up the plastic before it melts. And we're deluged in the remaining 5 gallons of gas. Well, I woke up Danny in the process of, panically doing it. I might have probably yelled at him, hey, it might be a disaster here. And Danny woke up, and Danny I think he survived largely off of cigarettes and Pepsi. So when he found out I had a can of Pepsi that I'd melted out, he promptly wanted to drink it, and I think he drank most of it down. And the problem was my mouth was such a mess, my face, I couldn't drink anything anyway. But anyway.
So you're saying you're looking at the mountains and something about...
Yeah, and you realize that, I realized that all of the things I had in the world, the money I had, the business, the airplanes, none of this was going to help me. That I was going to die right here looking at the mountains that I could see out of my living room window, and there was nothing I could do about it. You talk about things being out of your control. There was nothing more I could do. What saved us was friends. Once they realized where we're at, they did find us eventually with the CAP airplane. And what happened that night, they found us, and they sent a military helicopter, a Huey, from Fort Greely. But the weather was getting bad, and he was underneath the fog. We were above the weather, but the Mosquito Flats and the area where they were coming from was all fogged in. So there's some military guys in the Huey at night. They come up there, we could hear them. Thunk, 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 and they flew around, they left.
It must have been frustrating.
But, some guys in Toke, Bill Simmons, Jim Carson, Terry Overley, people that Danny and I knew, and people that are trapped in that area, they got on snow machines and started trying to get to where we were. Because now they knew where we were, but there wasn't a trail to there. So we could actually hear them that night, when it was cold and we could hear them, there's no other sounds. We could hear those snow machines in the distance, probably 10 miles away from where we were, but they never got up to us. It was just, we're up in just alders and no trail. But eventually the next morning, then the weather was bad the next day, but Charlie got a helicopter from Era and one from Thunder. And Charlie got in the Cub and led him out there. And Spike Jorgensen, good friend of mine, and Charlie's, and Barbara Wilberg, who is the public health nurse in Toke, came out. They came out with the Jet Ranger, I guess, and landed there. But then they couldn't take everybody back, so Spike stayed there. And Danny and I and Barbara and the pilot went back to Tanacross. That helicopter went back and got Spike, and then we loaded up in the Hughes 500, and they took us to the hospital in Fairbanks.
Man, that must have been surreal sitting there, hearing the snow machines, hearing the helicopter, and they're not able to get to you.
Yeah, like I said, it makes you realize that, we spent all our life working for money. And in the end, it was really people that saved us.
Well, I appreciate the wisdom and the stories. You've been so generous, dude. It's awesome.
So hopefully
I had a
some of them were
tremendous
even
amount of
true.
fun. Yeah, well, I mean, this is all fiction.
Yeah. People always say you should write a book. And I tell them, if I wrote a book, it would be fiction and I would be the hero. So hopefully it's not all fiction.
It's
and
perfect.
I'm just the hero.
It was perfect. Thanks. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you having me on.
All right, you made it to the end of the episode. That is an accomplishment. I really appreciate it. Obviously, you like this content. We're constantly shooting new episodes, and we have a lot of episodes in the can that we'll be posting soon. So subscribe, ring the bell, and that'll give you a notification when we post new episodes. In the meantime, like this content, comment on it, let us know what you think. And if you want to support our channel, go to sportaircraftseats.com and get seats for your airplane. We really appreciate it. Thank you.